Hello everyone, today we talk about the Hellenic cavalryman of around 400 BC. We already made several videos about Hellenic warfare. We will keep naturally making them. This is a unit, historical unit series episode, so it basically illustrates the armament and equipment of the Hellenic cavalrymen, let's say across this time, the 5th and the 4th century BC. So it doesn't talk about tactics specifically, if not, incidentally, because of course, what we will be saying about how they connect with the equipment, etc. And it's also not talking as a consequence about specific Hellenic cavalry actions just per se either, right? So there is all a space for tactics, battles. There are all the playlists tightly organized in that way, and we do this videos to highlight naturally the mindset, the physicality, in fact the panoply of these various units. And today's topic, however, cannot avoid to space a bit more broadly, in the sense that even though the series is organized around the obvious stereotypical approximation revolving a specific type of fighter, right, and how he could be equipped and what kind of gear he had, etc. The various even styles of arms, armor, etc. we will see now, has also to take in consideration the unknown that of course always exists historically, but especially in this case, right, for an arm that, as you know, was not dramatically developed, right? I have the impression actually that Hellenic cavalry was more developed than what we are normally more prone to believe, because of the sort of stereotypical categorization of Hellenic classical warfare as a sort of standard thing. It was always a system evolving. I realized that there are multiple videos on YouTube, because now top channels about this stuff tend to imitate one another on the most controversial topics, titles, this stuff, regarding the fact that we do not know how the Hellenic hoplites fundamentally fought in classical times, in all the issues of historiography. And let's dig deeper in this perspectives to really understand whatever. And they missed the most general point, that obviously it's not much a matter of, of course, not knowing how ancient warfare worked in detail, especially in a mechanistic sense, because banally we weren't there to videotape it. But because we say you could make a title for any kind of warfare, say even for how, I don't know, Celtic infantry function. It's true, of course, that about the Hellenic classical phalanx, much more has been written for obvious reasons, because of the centrality of Hellas at that point, and all the sort of connections that we feel morally, culturally, even personally to the classical world, and specifically the Hellenic polis. But the point is that there are ways and ways to, of course, teach the art of war, right? As you know, I specialize specifically in tactics for a living, so I tend to be quite sensitive to the of course, the positivistic delusion that we can, of course, know essentially how, say, combat functioned on the base, even, for example, of just, being armed like one of those guys and pretending to imitate that in some sort of reenaction. But I'm also, let's say, concrete enough to focus on those aspects that we can, however, establish, and that very often do not derive, in fact, from sort of how I think most people stop to, like the one-to-one fighting, like sort of the deadliest warrior approach, because they have no idea what, in fact, tactics, but even more broadly, probably the art of war is from a historical point of view, because you can't quite but do history when you, in fact, you wanna find out this stuff, and that derive, in fact, more often than not from the broader, say, opening, right, of your horizons regarding just first of all the info that we have overall, and the way we can essentially compose it, right? To look essentially at all the various influences that reveal, of course, the presence of certain ways of war, right, that haven't been, for example, recorded specifically or represented, or thought out, etc., and that very often, in fact, will have to do mostly with our unwillingness to see it, our prejudice, our narrow view of preconceptions that we really started with without really, in fact, not having one, either because we listened to somebody else or because we just wouldn't know, wouldn't see, wouldn't just get up to a certain point in the development of personal knowledge. For example, and I say this about the Hellenic cavalry for the simple reason that I could tell you this standard pack, equipment stereotypically based on certain types of helmets and, Xenophon's armor, the cavalry armor description, etc. Of course, if we want to stick to that, you have mostly to read the 12th chapter of The Art of Cavalry by Xenophon, that some say is also somehow dispositive, like as an advice, as an ideal or an optimum that even, of course, some horsemen were not willing for practical reasons to simply abide by, because they could not afford the equipment, or because warfare eventually also was taking other directions, and or again everything changes from battle to battle, from army to army, from soldier to soldier, as a matter of fact. But we have to take into account, aside from this sort of medium standard, the variety of cavalry, right? So today's video wouldn't be the best for it, because of course, there are other types of Hellenic cavalry that we could document, but very often they're not even so neatly conceptualized. For example, the cataphracts, right? That one associates mostly to a tradition of not just later times, but of essentially other peoples, right? Was a standard term that practically meant armored, and of course could be employed to describe certain fighters that were not, say, the sort of Clibanarius looking, Persian cavalrymen of late antiquity, but that could definitely be much heavier than what you would think. In fact, the average Hellenic cavalry of the time really was, for us, in fact, to focus mostly on that model, right? With the idea that cavalry also didn't play such a great role in Hellenic warfare, which is, honestly, every battle I've seen has something to do with cavalry, one or another, and it's easy to see actually that was a much more developed equestrian culture. It was the case, but also the sense that, again, that there is the social formula that the first of the class wants to point out. The polis was somehow, say, tending at least a concept that we think of to term democratic, and so of course Hellenic, say the political and politic system had developed at this point in anti-aristocratic, thus anti-cavalry function. Doesn't matter that de facto hoplites for especially in the earlier times were de facto mounted infantrymen, and that of course did not just ride to the battlefield, but were able, of course, to fight on horseback. Nobody would have to see why they would have not been. And while it is true, of course, that there is the problem of materialism, the fact that, with the usual exception of Sparta, it wasn't practically the sense that a professional military lifestyle was something a respectable Greek was called to perform, because essentially it was a matter of order, of collective discipline, and so that barbarians just would practice individually something more, in fact, warrioristic and individualistic in that kind. there is definitely the possibility that a notable part of Hellenic cavalry, even in the peak of a political warfare, say from Persian wars to the Peloponnesian one, was actually heavily armored, and there would have not been anything strange about that, right? Even in models that, given that half of what was called, say, what was Greece culturally was actually in Asia Minor, could easily resemble the Achaemenid cataphract, right? It wasn't, by the way, the full cataphract that we intend also of later times, but that even at that point we would have been probably surprised to notice it could be if we had just crossed the empire and watched several heavy cavalrymen. What kind of course of difference, of variety of customization, personalization, also varying in fact in the degree of wealth, of assets, of classes, etc., could be fielded, and these men were also habituated to fight in. Right, so this may be a controversial topic to begin with, but that's essentially why we are here in the first place. So, getting back to the more usual info, we can say that starting from clothing, actually, not from arms and armor. Let's invert for once the clothing properly of the Hellenic cavalryman was rather simple and light, right, as it would have been. Like in any circumstance anyway, a short tunic, the chiton, a light mantle, the chlamys, that would constitute, again, the habitual clothing, right? Then we know of the pretty fashionable broad-rimmed hat known as petasus, the high thick leather boots, the ambates, that Xenophon recommended for protecting the lower leg. In winter you could wear a heavier mantle, the imation. There are different, again, types of cavalry that before we were just hinting at. We will see now a bit more in detail, but we have to think again that wasn't a radical difference between a Hellenic horseman and one of, say, most sanitary peoples around, at least in a conceptual sense, then because especially as far as the lighter types were more common, again, they mostly operated in the same ways. Again, this was not like a warrioristic world, definitely, but there were notoriously areas like just already the north, like Boeotia, or other, provinces considered even borderline Greek as far as the higher models of political, institutional culture matured in Athens or Sparta were considering. That you can appreciate from other, let's say, countries where that had connection with the Greeks, right? That were imitating their art. For example, there's a lot of Etruscan stuff, for example, was either imported from Greece and or produced there. That shows, these also pretty fashionable youth that was equipped with the most updated clothing in vogue, and equipped with a couple of javelins that would fundamentally constitute what is thought, at least numerically, to have been the average classical horseman in Greece. Because the idea, and of course I didn't refer to it yet, but in hoplitic warfare, in hoplitic tactics, there wasn't much space for cavalry compared to infantry, right? And very often, everything that wasn't this hoplitic, say, centrality is not described, right? If we read all the all the sources, we know the literature, even the poetry, so we realize that guys like slingers, javeliners, mounted, there's, say, in the case of javeliners mounted, dismounted, whatever, were always there. Archers, right? And that, of course, they comforted the most heavy phalanx of infantrymen that, however, were also by background still connected ancestrally to the idea that once, let's say, the guy who could be heavily equipped, even as a hoplite, even though, of course, the individual heaviness of these guys was on average decreasing, because also tactics were becoming more performing. I made a video about the Battle of Leuctra, the concept of mass, like the so-called. It wasn't much actually of an oblique order, in the sense that we tend commonly to compare with also Frederick the Great, right? I explained this about the battle, but it's obvious that all these troops were still backed, and increasingly so, especially from the Peloponnesian War onwards, by more different troops, right? Different tactical specialties. Also because the Greeks were starting to fight, the Greeks that had, again, in the heart of Hellas, developed what we think as this classical model that really wouldn't develop out of the motherland, not even in the same Hellenic colonies in that way. In fact, had to start fighting elsewhere, on a different ground, against different enemies, so with different tactical influences, etc. Right. So, aside from the classical times, narrowly meant, we have different treatises that we can count in the one of Asclepiodotus, of Aelianus, of Arrian, even, though in this case we're writing in the 1st, 2nd century AD, but that also were basing themselves widely on the military customs of the previous centuries that hadn't really changed that much, and that I mention here because they were essentially distinguishing 3 types of cavalrymen, to each of which corresponded functionally a different type of armament, right? And that's where we get, in fact, to the aforementioned cataphracts that I explained, in fact, in the etymology of, so not necessarily the guy that has been mimified by video games in the last decade on the internet, but simply a substantially armored, right, heavily armored, metal armored horseman that could be so just even as such, right, not necessarily even in the same way as the horse, like speaking of the degree of armor cover that, as you know, historically and also the Middle Ages really show, was something really, really rare, even for the ultra elite, because simply, horse armor cost an astronomical cipher that even some of the richest couldn't quite afford. And so again, in classical Greece, was not really definitely a usual thing to see, because also the social certification was, at least initially, somehow depending, say, in the middle, again in the peak of political warfare, somehow balanced and not entailing, again, as a meaningful force, definitely one of elite metal armored horsemen, right? Even maybe with barded horses. So the sense is that, again, the cataphract was mostly conceived as a guy that had his torso armored, right? Wore an enveloping helmet and various protections on the limbs. Also, the horse could be, this was also the case, in fact, protected by some barding, right? That usually the chamfron was the most typical protection for the horse. That was actually quite common instead among heavy cavalrymen all over. That's technically plate armor, also chest armor, etc. That could count as a sort of ultra heavy cavalry that we can account among the cataphracts. While the offensive weapons consisted for this category in a long lance and a heavy sword, Xenophon himself actually recommends armoring the head, neck, chest, sides, and belly of the horse. This will have been leather quilting rather than metal again, because it would have been extremely expensive, and just from a structural point of view, the Greeks wouldn't make use of large bodies of ultra heavily armored horsemen. However, Xenophon's advice still speaks of something that we see banally because of the heroic nudity of Hellenic iconography, rarely, right? And that would have been actually much more frequent together with the heaviness of cavalry. Think about this. The sense that the same Hellenic art, right, the beauty of classical statues, the ideal of bodily perfection, divinity, etc., deprived us of a great deal in these idealized forms of course, what people would have looked like on a more regular basis, arms and armor of the various heroes, fighters, etc., gods represented, right, in this art. In any case, passing to the second typology spotted by ancient authors was constituted those horsemen that fought exclusively at a distance, or at least just by default functionally, as archers, right, on horseback. The Hippotoxotai, also known as Scythians, because of the, of course, the nomadic practice of fighting was entirely mounted and skirmishing with this very large amounts, in fact, of missile horsemen. The most famous horse archers were the Cretans. Now, the Hippotoxotai were more widespread than one thinks, ideally because, of course, they were, say, horses cost a lot just by themselves. Logistically, to supply them, they're very resilient, but also quite delicate animals. But the concept that you could still somehow harass the enemy with more agile forces that could also, say, lay waste to the enemy countryside, pillage the enemy camp during the battle, all this stuff was present, of course, also in political warfare, right? More than we tend to think, at least in the standardized, stereotyped way. The third category was of an intermediate nature, constituted by, let's say, light cavalrymen in the guise of skirmishers, as essentially as javelins, right? But also bow, depending on the situation. These were known as acroballistae, and they were normally deployed on the wings and provided with this, in fact, light gear. The javelins they used, by the way, were short, this was known as the Acontian type, to throw a considerable distance, right, not at short range. Those that were equipped with such javelins were also at some point called Tarentines. This is something, but starting, around this time, which stemmed from the fact that this tactical specialty apparently had stemmed from Taurus, the Hellenic colony in southern Italy, and or that lots of Tarentines performed this tactical role, where again we have seen this happen. As a medievalist, I always make the case of the Welsh archers in the English armies of the 100 Years' War. People are convinced that the Welsh archers were better than the English ones, and there is no polemological proof of any kind, right? Not even what Giraldus Cambrensis says, from which most people have, say, in fact, made up the story, it refers to that, or tells you that. But the fact that Wales, say, in that case, was poorer than England, and in fact Welsh archers were paid less than the English ones, by the way, which surely meant something also in terms of performance, that were pretty good, English woodmen communities famed for their archery skills, were of course more likely to join as mercenaries, right, from the most depressed areas of Britain, as would happen also with Scotland and Ireland, as with different specialties in different times, medieval, modern history, and so you can see the same thing a bit here. That of course we have plenty of names even for weapons, right? That were all pre-Linnaean terms, but they could be called after a specific, of course, function. But the fact that a type of unit had traditionally been called like that, and it remained called like this, even in for example, in which the case of the Tarentines were not to be found really from southern Italy anymore, serving as mercenaries, because it had become a synecdoche, right, based on the way that we do not know even so wholly and completely such units or weapons or fighting styles were intended at the time. In fact, there were even two subtypes of the Tarentines. One that was limited to throw javelins from a distance, and that were, for this reason, also known as Ippacontistae. And these were technically and apparently the Tarentines properly said. We will make a video about the Tarentines at some point. And I made also a video about the Psylloi, right, and other skirmishers on foot, by the way, in Hellenic warfare. And the other one capable of engaging in close combat, hand-to-hand combat, actually, with sword or axe, interestingly enough. These were likely also fighting styles coming from places like the Balkans, the Balkan hinterland, and this type were known as the Elafroi, which has to do with their lightness fundamentally, but they were still conceived as, again, capable of fighting in close combat. Then, of course, these categories are very, again, they're from later authors, as we will see also in other videos. Things were more nuanced, which is obvious because such three types of cavalry still do not tell us much. For example, about how the heavies could be equipped with for which kind of other specific purpose that would take the name, for example, after weapons, right? So Arrian lists Doriforoi, Contoforoi, and Locoforoi. This distinction stemmed from essentially the type of lengths that we're using, right? That of course was important as far as the tactical specialty, but it could overlap loosely on the first categorization. Instead had to do mostly with the lightness or heaviness of cavalry. Speaking of Arrian's triad, here we see the Lonche, that notoriously was a term, again, for whoever has listened to my Carthaginian warfare videos knows is criminally nuisance, because Connolly, by translating, getting the first term from the Loeb translator, essentially termed Lonche as pike, right, as sarissa, and basically turned out the Carthaginians, that through Greek sources were called as, having the Lonchi, would have turned to be like Macedonian Sarissophoroi in Hellenistic times. And the worst about this is not just the sheer philological ignorance by one of also the most famous authors out there, but the fact that everybody repeated him. And so you find even as historical art, like if you Google from stuff from Osprey, etc., depicting Carthaginian infantry with essentially as Macedonian pikemen, right? Which is terrifying. The Lonche was actually it could be different types of things that could be considered like a sort of short length and or heavy javelin that could be in fact thrown also short distance, as actually most of these, in fact, spears/javelins that you could find all over the world, right? Basically, all the sedentary peoples, like in Europe, the Mediterranean, and North Africa, were on average equipped with a spear you could technically also throw. We have seen it also in the genesis of the pilum, in that video I made about Italic warfare, and so especially the 5th and 4th century BC javelins. There was also, as we've seen, also from the same Hellenic cavalry equipment, like there's different types of javelins that were designed, just like the Roman pilum, but it was the light type, the heavy type that were to be thrown at different distances, right? So everything was actually much more universal than we tend to think, right? The long tail can be understood as this. It's found as marine's length at some other point. The important thing, of course, is that the Greeks also later in Hellenistic times kept, of course, describing a great part of all the other people's warfare, including the Roman one, etc. So you must learn the terms and being able to contextualize them by realizing what conceptually these terms meant, right? There wasn't a long head that was like, a standardized weapon that was always in the same way, it was more like a concept, right? That sometimes even etymologically speaking, we can't quite simply translate into a specific type of weapon. In any case, again, going back to Arrian's tripartition, the Doru and the Contus were longer impact spears, better suited for cavalry charges, in fact. Plutarch, in his Alexander 33, uses the term xyston to indicate heavy lance used by, in fact, Alexander's cavalry. Yes, we're talking here about Hellenic 400 BC horsemen, but say they were, in fact, again, pretty close times and places, by the way. Other historians use the term sarissa, all right, even for, of course, for cavalry, all right. And so while this would indicate also the pike used by the infantry phalanx, the cavalry one didn't have to be much longer than 4 meters. Like, people say, well, the sarissa was like 8 meters long. It was actually just 4 or 5. It could vary at some point, of course, but I shall make a video in depth about that because it's not such an easy thing to just discuss, especially as a digression on another theme video. In any case, as we were saying at the beginning, the say more fixed, stereotypical, in fact, typically Hellenic radical insight from the same times concerning the ideal armament of an Hellenic cavalryman is described by Xenophon in the 12th chapter of his Art of Cavalry, which has, in fact, by approximation correctly, bit embodied the standard of what we could call medium cavalry, right? In the art of war, there is no such thing like a medium, either you're heavy or light, but of course you can compare even within the heavies something that here is not to be conceived as a cataphract, for example. This type of cavalryman contemplated, instead of the lance with the long shaft, known as the doru kamakinon, the use of 2 short javelins, the palthav Persian type in cornel wood, one for being thrown at a distance, the other for close combat. Xenophon suggests that the officers should attend javelin practice as an example to the men to do so, right? And the general outlook here is the one of, again, a type of cavalry who is capable of, in fact, and would normally engage, in fact, into hand-to-hand combat, but not without having at least the capacity to soften up the enemy ranks before, in fact, charging in. And the interesting thing is that probably this was a necessity for attacking infantry as well, right? Because of course cavalry wasn't thrown frontally against the hoplitic infantry on a regular basis. Actually, we have seen in some engagements, even of course chariotery could smash into hoplitic lines, as the Achaemenids successfully proved, exploiting Hellenic disorder at the Battle of Dasculion. But let's say the sense of attacking from the flank, for example, and also taking on hoplites, close range, etc., was a thing. Adding to it, not just the spear, but the type of, as you've seen, substantial armor that Xenophon was recommending for horsemen, right? That, as we'll see now, weren't even required a particular amount of stuns, at least in combat. They had to engage, however, against one another, could of course be hit by enemy projectiles, but in this sense, in a context in which, say, the aforementioned lighter troops could be taken on by the same cavalry. Both, we're talking about skirmishers, for example, both on foot and on horseback, right? Such a Xenophonian profile is, after all, in perfect agreement with what emerges from the majority of iconographic evidence, after all, right? Aside from armor, as we were saying before, that probably prevented this necessity of depiction of, the idealized bodies and so on. The horseman is armed almost always with two short javelins, right? You can see it among the many pictures that are uploaded here. In any case, the lance did constitute the most important armament of the horsemen, in the same way it was for the infantrymen, the hoplite, right? So this, of course, doesn't tell us that the Hellenic cavalry was essentially the mounted equivalent of the hoplite. Also, again, we're talking here specifically about 400 BC, so we're just in the same times of Xenophon, and of course there was a change over time in Hellenic cavalry that we will see in other videos. In any case, by Xenophon times, the use of cavalry was to increase substantially, right? And this is the same reason why the same Xenophon, that had, as you know, served also abroad, had been fighting against the Persians. I mean, even on their own ground, was forced to acknowledge the importance of cavalry and all the various precautions that such evident tactical, let's say, experience, right, common experience, was suggesting, was requiring. Speaking of the armor, in fact, the thorax, this had to be well, of course, adapted anatomically. We are talking about worlds in which especially those who would fight on horseback had their arms and armor, say, possibly, of course, depending on the circumstances, designed, measured exactly for their body sizes, in order to ergonomically allow for all the movements needed. Regarding what I said before about stunts, we will see now that Xenophon is very cautious. Like, he mostly describes at least a type of warfare that didn't entail a particular capacity of evolution on horseback, right, by the horseman. It was all looking somehow clumsy, prudent, etc. This meaning, of course, that movements were relatively minimal. As we will see now, the horses were not famously provided. There weren't saddles, there wasn't horseshoeing, etc. So, of course, you had to be very, very careful while on horseback. In that sense, it would minimize the most dangerous movements. But of course, in combat, right, you had to be as agile as you could. In any case, again, speaking about the thorax, this could be in iron or bronze of the same type of diplomatic one. In that case, you would have a substantially heavy type of horseman. Arrian, of course, later source, Arrian 4.1, lists the scaled cuirasses, the folly dotois, right, that were likely constituted by iron or bronze lamella, but also cuirasses in linen or even in horn, right, which was a thing, really, more frequently than we think. This depended, of course, on what kind of result you wanted to have. It's not just about the price, it's also about the type of cavalry and how the thorax fit a broader opological system. Consider this specifically, that every type of armor design that you can see was produced basically in every single type of material available, at least of the ones used for armor in general. Aside from the types, we see it very clearly. We've found even, bronze pieces of Lorica segmentata, right? And people say there were, of course, organic material as well. Yes, right. Everything. It was not much about the, let's say, there weren't types of armor that, of course, some of those, let's say, chainmail, for example, had to be more preferably of iron for different reasons, but especially the plate one, let's say, the scale one, the lamellar one, were, of course, of all the possible types, right? One of the rare models of metallic cuirass that we got from around this period is preserved at the Archaeological Museum of Bari in southern Italy, dating to the 4th century BC. It presents this, by the way, very evident rising of the of essentially leg protection, designed like this exactly to allow a more comfortable use on horseback. So, of course, in the more recent representation, there is a very spread classical taste of this, say, pressed linen cuirass that is traditionally the lightest protection of the hoplite. This was, again, occurring not just because it was happening because, again, to the individual as a sort of warrior, as still ideally ancestrally in the earlier times, the hoplite really was, like coming from the Bronze Age, all covered, also with very heavy armor, etc., until the 6th century, etc., even the beginning of the 5th. The increase in size of armies, right, greater collective discipline, was rendering such individual effort useless, right? It was much easier, again, think about Leptra, to beat the heavier with numbers, with maneuver, right, and sometimes the sheer force as well, that the sense was not necessarily just about the heaviness of the equipment. So we see lighter, even linen helmets, for example. The helmet, of course, is the most important element of armor, given that it has to protect the most vulnerable, the most important parts of your body. But it was accepted, let's say, because what you could save in cost could allow you to, for example, field more troops, right? And so you had to dilute, right? And everything you see in warfare is the compromise between those things. The diggings of what was thought, at least, to be Philip II of Macedon's tomb in Vergina, in Macedonia, brought to light a very similar corselet in the form to the linen one, but made up by iron lamellar, showing what I was saying before about the essential, say, importance of the design, let's say, over material, at least in the logic in which the design was developed, right? Not because, of course, this material wouldn't make the difference, right? In, say, in combat, and also as a consequence, also in the units, right? You can't quite maneuver, let's say, a unit so heavily armored like a much lighter one, even though you have essentially the same design. These things are important, but right, it's more about the say the structure, right, and why it was conceived differently from other types of armor, right, that matters here, even though we're looking here also relatively standard proceedings, right? There weren't so many different ways of making armor in the first place. Xenophon deems the Boeotian helmet the most suited for cavalrymen because it allows better protection without hampering complete view. And this aspect is important because the Boeotian helmet can be best described as a metal hat with downturned brim, and for cavalry use it has this advantage that the face was open. The wearer could hear commands as well without difficulty, and this was very important evidently for units that did perform complex maneuvers. After all, there is a video made on Athenian cavalry that tells you about the actual stunts there they had to do. At least they had to be very not much on horseback, of course, but and because even without horseshoes, saddle, at least, well, in that case maybe there were some developments, but say other peoples like the Celts, and of course in an age without stirrups, did practice an enormous amount of stunts for different reasons now we can't explain compared to the Greeks, right? But as far as, for example, the unit, the formation order, right, at least the best cavalry units were capable of performing quite complex and even daring bold maneuvers that required very precise space to move in these parades in which you could even crash at full gallop against somebody coming frontally against you from the other side. So while Xenophon tells us probably this through this helmet type, we must always consider that the usual lack of standardization would, however, have prevailed. Every type of helmet would have been worn by cavalrymen. Here, of course, there were sort of public arsenals of sort, but they weren't exactly producing, say, emphasizing the necessity of standardization, because they had to field regularly so many, such large amounts of men, like the later Romans in Marian times, etc. The important was just to have available equipment, and especially who would serve on horseback would be more affluent to customize more than, say, the average final rank hoplite his own equipment. This is important. It's a sort of a hybrid system where the state partly intervenes, but also private means are there in a relevant fashion. The Boeotian helmet could, by the way, be the same model represented in the one found in 1854 in the Tigris River, and largely represented, by the way, in the iconography of Alexander's enterprise. So you realize that even though the Macedonian army would be something importantly different, and I made a video about the Antigonids, rather I talk about also Alexander's panoply. For that matter, we've seen Thessalian cavalry also throughout different ages, the more archaic, the more modern, in fact, Alexandrian one. So there is all a picture there that tells you, of course, how many different cultural influences were building up effectively what would become this mashing, truly feudal Macedonian cavalry. It was already there in many ways, but would be reinforced, of course, more at the time of the empire and throughout Hellenistic times, the kingdoms of which founded by the Megas. And the Diadochoi would be very, very different, in fact, from the more, say, conservative Greece. But as we explained many times, the technological differences were not dramatic, right? And helmet types were also a matter of fashion sometimes, right? There was always a functionality to it. You can't quite separate the two things, and there is tendentially a direct proportionality between the two. But the fact tribute to an older tradition that had favored, say, a type of helmet rather than another, even in contexts like, again, the one of royal equipment, etc., was important. As we were saying before, the design was even more important than the material was this armor was built like. So we find it replicated with also throughout important times. I made a video about the Roman Hellenistic helmets, for example. I have to re-upload with adequate pictures, but this stuff was present all over. Like Greece at this point was really exporting arms and armor everywhere in the Mediterranean. Some vascular imagery shows us the use of a Corinthian type of helmet, but they refer to, at least prevalently, the oldest time in which, in fact, as we said before, the cavalryman was essentially a mounted hoplite, right? And even though cavalry would revive during the 4th century BC, as we know, still Xenophon sometimes in his work about warfare, his treatise on cavalry, suggests that the cavalryman's main preoccupation, in a sense, was to remain on horseback, right? He advises his readers that horses may be safely ridden downhill, for example, without dislocating their shoulders, right? So certain hints, as we were talking about before, about a not dramatically dynamic way of fighting on horseback. Because even though clamorously violent cavalry impacts existed and were always entailed in combat, the sense was that this cavalry, as we've seen, was just operating a bit as a support of infantry, and mostly used in order to outflank the same from the other side. And even though engaging with other cavalry, being still, as we've seen, also partly versed in skirmishes, etc. So not being this, like the Macedonian feudal one would brutally specialize itself in, as the truly, very feudal cavalry in the entire Europe, sedentary Europe, right? So the heaviest, the best one, with all the necessity to have a greater grip. And of course, in that case, by the way, the Macedonian cavalryman was habitually a much more of a warrior than, of course, an Hellenic peasant soldier, right? That was technically also refusing, from a cultural point of view, this continuous training and practice, that instead was proper of the incredibly violent Macedonian aristocracy. Other iconographic evidence referred especially to the colonies of the Magna Graecia in southern Italy and Sicily, suggest in that region spread use of the Chalcidian type of helmet. These are, again, preferences that unfortunately we can't trace back to necessarily a specific rationale. In this case, I wouldn't know. It may have had, because the Chalcidian helmet is more enveloping in some way. So you see, even in Illyrian warfare, this say similar designs trending on a structural basis, and it may have been about the more sort of almost wrestling combat that could take place in these areas that were yes, still operating basically with heavy infantry, etc., but also developing much more cavalry and also with much more active and risky tasks against really good cavalries like the Carthaginian and the Italic ones, and that required therefore something more perhaps anatomic, right, and something more, say, it's something also more enclosed, right, more protected. This is just an idea. There is also the Thracian type of helmet that, as you know, came from a people that had also a consistent, in fact, mounted element in the Balkans, and that encloses, especially with the cheek plates, right, the face well, it's compact, and it starts having, in fact, a great spread starting from the 5th century. We'll talk about all these types of designs when we talk about the relative peoples. We will talk about, say, the Magna Graecia or Magna Graecia, if you prefer, about this various regional variations, also in Asia Minor. Like, again, most of what we know, famously enough, about classical hoplite warfare has to do specifically with Athens and Sparta. Right, already Boeotia and other lands were really not having the same thing. They had more cavalry, and they did also different types of infantry, etc. And this also contributed eventually to the effort of the Athenians and the Spartans abroad, right, to make everything more flexible to given the circumstances. There was also the alopecis, so-called in the form of helmet, because it looked like wolf skin, right? It was a Thracian helmet, right? And there was the crested helmet, for example, a beautiful one preserved at the British Museum in London. There are others, for example, of later times, especially with the Phrygian top, right, with the mask paragnatids preserved in the Archaeological Museum of Sofia in Bulgaria. Again, we will see about all this stuff, but these are all types of helmets that you would have seen easily employed by our average Hellenic cavalryman of 400 BC specifically. Speaking of the sword, so passing finally to the offensive gear, at least as far as the chopping dimension is concerned, Xenophon, famously enough, suggests the use of the machaira, or kopis, essentially a curved saber, and also a pretty heavy one, really suited for cutting from top down, rather than the xiphos, that was the straight sword normally used by infantry, right? And the kopis, which is a Persian term, by the way, used to indicate this weapon derived from the rhomphaia of Thracian origin, was used also by the hoplitic infantry in close combat in order to, in fact, hit with pretty heavy blow the enemy over, we think, of course, there were all ways, but preferably the big circular shields, and it had a profile studied in a way that could, in fact, shift the mass of the sword towards the most likely point of impact, that is, the tip. Right, and this swords, and people say, in fact, the usual things about Hellenic warfare, but they didn't have cavalry, they didn't have archers, they didn't have, seriously, or among the other things, the hoplitic the hoplite was not much of a swordsman. This is true, in the sense, of course, that aside from the Spartans, nobody was specifically trained to fight with a sword. But the kind of swords that they used, notoriously, were massive, right? They say the little sword, the Xyphus. We're talking about really large and also impressive blades that, of course, required a certain... Because here we should digress on the physics of the sword, and it's not really the video. I promise I will make something more specific about this. But the impression is that, of course, given that these were cutting swords prevalently, they required less training, right? This is a thing that we often get wrong about hoplitic warfare, and generally speaking, ancient warfare, that all these people say, and because it's a culturalist prejudice, right? It came around with the new military history of people that began to think that the most important thing about war was studying society, so another subject, and people that were traumatized about the Vietnam War, and so this fear of bodily engagement and losses, etc., is that even the most amateurish hoplitic infantrymen, that was so because notoriously Hellenic warfare was amatorial, right? There wasn't such a thing like a professional dimension. Again, Sparta is the only exception. Even in that case, it was not this, it was mostly about discipline of collective formation, not about this enormous individual effort, right? Comparatively, a Celt or an Illyrian or an Italic was scholarly much more brutally trained at every level, even just as an average warrior, except the collective discipline, which is something that only civilization, in fact, gradually is able to confer, and that really makes the military superiority there, at least if the model you develop is capable of adapting also to the outer world, which, at least in the case of the Spartans, as you know, was another story. We'll talk more about the Spartans and their, say, pros and cons as far as the context is concerned, especially because that's all about it. But the point I was making is that even the single most average amateurish hoplitic infantryman was a person who was brought up in an unspeakably violently traumatized way concerning everything that had to do with divine transfiguration, Achilles, body counts, massacres, right? This was classical antiquity. It wasn't about, democracy or freedom or this bullshit. It was about rigid brutality of the most divinely hierarchically ordered universal order, world order. Right, this is the sole purpose that every human being has had until a couple of hundred years ago. And even these more civilized peoples were exclusively about this, right? So the lack of military professionalism and so of adequate discipline and training to some extent that the hoplites, in fact, didn't quite have, right? It's embarrassing to see still how often people think that, for example, the Greeks were more military advanced than the Persians. And this has nothing to do with why they won, right? Which is another story, right? But people, again, are fixated with mechanistic stuff, still think, I don't know, that militaries win because, there was a metal rather than another employed by a civilization and the other fighting. We are at this level of radical average, of average adult radical underschooling, also by First World standards, because let's be honest, also, of course, all the rest of the world, but even the average person brought up in the West has nothing to do with Western tradition whatsoever. They do not match First World primary schooling by any stretch of the imagination. In any case, these people would just, and this is the simplest thing that's really shown by, the only positive thing that I think reenactment shows is that every single imbecile can throw himself and getting himself killed into the heat of action. It doesn't take anything. Every idiot is capable of just being carried away by emotion and trying to smash against somebody, right? Except this has nothing to do with military quality, right? Courage without intelligence exclusively makes you killed, right? There's not another option in the store. And of course, weapons like the Kopis were completely functional to this incredibly wild unleashment of force that also especially in earlier times, the applied equipment was pretty heavy, as you know. And that's all was required, physical strength, but also minimal training of some other stuff, right? It was a miracle that, for example, the Hellenic infantry at Marathon maintained cohesion, just running literally under Persian fire. But this was the Kopis, perhaps the single best type of weapon you could brandish, even if you weren't properly proficient at this type of war. We've seen it even actually in steppes warfare, right? If you wonder why at some point, for example, with the arrival of the Turks, the Mongols, sabers took over the straight sword of the Indo-Europeans, that required the latter a magnitudinally much more sophisticated training than the saber. It's mostly because of this, because there were, after that, the steppes were spent, there were just masses of exhausted subjects that couldn't even have anything in terms of training equipment. They just had a bow, a quiver, and in fact a saber that was much simpler to use than a straight sword, and that shows first that the preferred target there was softer, right? And it basically would be hit in a condition of mostly not face-to-face direct clash, but sort of, passing side to side, right? So the physics of this sword make actually curved blades better for mounted warfare, but when in fact, the engagements have mostly that kind of nature. The size here does differ because, of course, you can have a curved blade but still being very effective to do lots of things, even against armor, etc. So when you look at the size of the Kopis, for example, you realize that, of course, also the average Hellenic cavalryman knew how to handle this in a slightly more proficient way, of course, that the infantryman could do, and that required, in fact, some extra capacity in a much more difficult situation with this precarious stability again, in times where there weren't stirrups, there weren't horseshoes, there were the hippo sandals, stuff like that, but they were riding even without a saddle, right? So the thing is just left to your imagination. But even in this clumsy situation, a weapon like the Kopis could be quite effective, and it still entails also a hand-to-hand fighting, of course. So that, of course, is the function of cavalry all the time. There isn't a single cavalry that is, not even the Hippotoxotai said, well, I will never charge anybody or will never engage into hand-to-hand combat. They will, by the way. Even against heavier opponents that are not fleeing, etc., right? So that's quite a thing. Never underestimate also moral forces, right? There were, throughout all military history, units that would simply sacrifice themselves rather than, say, in a part of a concerted plan to, for example, buy time for others or faking to be a battle line rather than another. It's always there. Of course, it requires some capacity, but it could be carried out even by squires, by people who are not really the professional elite, right? It's with a Kopis, by the way, that in the Battle of Granicus, Cleitus was capable of cutting cleanly the arm of an enemy that was threatening Alexander's life, right? As Arrian says in the Anabasis of Alexander 115.8, right? Regarding the defenses, Xenophon prescribes a series of additional precautions. The neck protection, the one deemed to be one of the most vital is to be kept safe by a cover that had to start from the back of the armor. In order to protect the left flank, that without a shield, as we will see now, usually, right? At least we don't see many shields around. Is as a consequence the most exposed side of the body. Xenophon recommends, in particular, one type of armor, the so-called hand, the Keira, that would cover at least the shoulder, the arm, and the fingers of the hand. Unfortunately, even though we have an idea of how it could have been, and I think we talked about it in some other video, we do not have any clear picture or description in detail of the care of this element, so everything about it is fundamentally conjectural. This aspect is fascinating because it could point at what we were just saying, that at least at close range the enemy could be threatened mostly by the cutting blow of a side weapon, which is fascinating because here we don't have to think again about hard armor. It could have been just a padded type, the Keira, but it makes you think about the general use of the shield. And so very often in Hellenic historiography we find this sort of technicistic idealism of some sort that in fact we narrated very much as Westerners, that basically is sort of self-satisfied of suggesting this sort of technical smart-ass ideas that, however, in practice are not really going to work that much. I mean, pretty much all the infantry, also with very or very light or no armor at all, would normally have a shield, right? Even a little one. So why would at this point the Greeks use just the sort of say armor? Nobody really understands, right? It's likely that you could have a shield together with it, but we don't see, again, as we'll see better also now, much of a shield around for this average Hellenic cavalryman. The right vambrace, according to Xenophon, by the way, has to be protected by a something apparently heavier, that is an element similar to the greave for the leg, of course. So in that instance we see actually something heavier, because the shield would have not been handled with the right hand. At least everything could happen, and also weapons could be used in the most bizarre ways, and it does happen quite frequently actually. But the sense is here that you are just handling, as we've seen, the spear, the javelins, and you can't defend your arm that is exposed, and so you would want to defend it with some sort of armor, right? So on the left side, apparently you have something slightly lighter, and given that the enemy, by the way, would normally attack you on the right flank more easily, right? Because at least, you know, he would have to cross the spear from the other side in order to attack your left side from the other side. This may be the reason why the Keira would have been perhaps lighter, and in a situation in which apparently the shield isn't there, right? But this is not entirely clear from the text. Speaking of the lower belly and the genitals, this would be protected by some wings, the famed pterygus of leather, or in fact padded textile. And this was just a minimal protection, of course, but was a sort of an additional layer of sort protecting your lower parts. Naturally, also the horse, as we've seen, had to be provided with adequate barding on the on the forehead. The prometopedian would be the most common one, the chest plate, in fact, or whatever it was, the prosternedian. And even on the flanks, this is also fascinating, the parameridian, which here could have, say, Xenophon says, especially you have to protect the belly and the thighs of the horse. This is fascinating because normally even some very heavy type of horse barding didn't cover the part in between, because in part there was just the leg of the horseman from on the side. So in a way it was okay, if they are going to hit me there, I hope I have good leg armor of some sort that apparently here wasn't quite there, unless we think there was this sort of padding stuff. But protecting the thighs specifically means that there was some padding in the rear of the horse as well. So if you think that it could have been, again, in the cataphract case, like again, a metal armor even, in the ultra-elite case, and the rare one that, as we've seen, could still be possible in classical Greece. Well, here we're talking about a very heavy armor, and a sort of really cataphract-like, also full cataphract sort of look, that entails, by the way, that the horseman has to be equally protected like. You see, normally the proportion in antiquity, even for half-armored horses that were the norm, usually compared, say, as heavily armored cavalry, other than the cataphract, it would somehow lose steam. Even in Persia, that would revert in Sasanian times to some sort of half-armored, in fact, cavalry. Means that is always that the guide is on horseback is much better armored than the same animal, right? For obvious reasons, and this entails that this Xenophonian cavalry, if properly barded and armored, was quite impressive, right? At least in a structural way. It could be, again, just all padded armor, for example, but evidently not just, right? The prometopedian, the prosternedian could be easily of metal, but also the parameridian at that point. So that would look impressive, and the guy on horseback could be very heavily armored, maybe even more, who knows, than the hoplite elite. Because, by the way, it goes without saying that, especially in Xenophon's time, this is not just about a mounted hoplite, but it's a guy that will prevalently fight on horseback as opposed to the guy in the phalanx that would preferably fight on foot. They would be able, say, the horseman to fight dismounted as well, but probably with a different type of equipment that had to be prepared in that case, right? So that they had to change themselves at least, etc. And this is very fascinating, because it means we have probably overlooked the possibility of some sort of very heavy cavalryman, compared even to the hoplite element in this Hellenic armies, where you think that, it was just about the infantryman. Well, it evidently wasn't, right? Even numerically, if you pick some proportions, the cavalry wasn't that few in Xenophon times, for example. Starting from the Peloponnesian War, we're talking about very consistent numbers sometimes, right? Then consider that these are times that we can document better, and paradoxically, in Hellenistic times, we would know much less even about the Hellenic motherland than before, because society changed. In fact, aristocracy increased, and the common people were not just, again, the same ones who participated to the phalanx could write stories about it because they were sort of citizens that could speak of it at home and were famous. But that increase in aristocratic power, as also the Macedonian example proves, is also an increasing cavalry force, right? So we've seen in the case of the Seleucid army, etc., even how the various Hellenic cities within the Diadochi kingdoms were ruled by a sort of oligarchy that could feel like not the cavalry was not as good as the feudal one, but it was also very rich and relatively heavy, right? Considering at least that it was well armed, well equipped. And this is definitely fascinating. It should be investigated more, connected with the prior times, especially since as we've seen, mounted hoplites weren't surely just the guys like, I don't know, the Anglo-Saxons, it's been told in different contexts, that would just ride to battle and then dismount to fight. I call BS on that, right? It is true that it would do that in that case normally, but this doesn't mean that they wouldn't know how to fight on horseback. Then, of course, they likely didn't have the resources to do so in a professional way. This is true. Also, the numbers were limited, of course. But if you go back, the more back in time you go, and the more you see that, of course, that model stems from de facto the Bronze Age demigod that actually rode to battle on a chariot. And if you look at even, I don't know, places like Sicily, etc., you realize that there was still much more sort of that aristocratic culture probably surviving, or even reviving, of course, in the age of tyrants and Hellenism there, from a political basis, from the one of the polis. So these are all considerations that we must take into account when we realize that our culture, after, say, in the second half of the 20th century, has wanted to depict Hellenic warfare in a very specific way. It was very just, again, democratic and republican, and that has actually very few to do with what the case of Greece actually was. So that the essentials remain valid, because we definitely know that, yes, Hellenic warfare was about this heavy infantry corps that was the size, was the one around which most of this deal would revolve. But there were also lots of other elements that altogether with the phalanx would make the decisive. It was still about combined arms, right? It was becoming ever more so at this point. Finally, about the shield. In Xenophon, there is no reference to the use of a shield. Right? You know that Xenophon is very analytical, very Greek, again, in the way he writes, he thinks, unavoidably. Even though he has also experience of barbarian warfare, let's say. And you would think, analytically, he would talk about all these various details, the smaller ones, impressions, etc., name the shield at some point. Especially in a military culture like the Hellenic one, that was literally based on the idea that especially infantry units were named after their shield, not after their main weapon, right? Which is interesting, because as we've seen, at least in later times, Hellenistic, let's say this cavalry types were designed with the name of the spear. The Romans, for example, differently from the Greeks, that had symmetric armies, etc., named units after their offensive weapons, not the defensive one. So this is an interesting food for thought, also as far as the political implications of, for example, who these people that also wrote these treatises were, compared to, again, what was going on internationally. As you know, the Spartan connection and the Athenian one and the Persian one in Xenophon's life, all the military experience across the space, the sense that times were changing in favor of some sort of more aristocratic direction after all, because of course that sort of democratic background had been deteriorating in some way. So the point being, however, that cavalry was eventually seen and just for obvious reasons, given that it's an arm that can only offend by definition, cannot defend unless it is mounts, so that's an infantry, can in fact only offend, right? And so has obviously that much different mindset than the basic politic one has. right? And that is exactly that struggle that we were talking about before, like the hoplitic defender against the cavalry offender, at the roots of the polis of this sort of peasant citizen soldiery, all right? Polybius 625 states, but that's a very controversial passage that actually doesn't, we know that it's not how things went, said that essentially Roman cavalry updated its equipment to the Hellenistic one around, his times, talking mostly about, in fact, the Second Punic War, those times of greater, say, Roman stepping further in the art of war, etc. And he uses the term tureos, which, as we have countlessly explained and made a video about the tureophoroi, was actually a type of shield that, albeit existing as simply a novel one everywhere, including in Greece for a much longer time, was actually introduced sometime around the 80s, the 70s of the 3rd century BC, to the point of creating these units, right, of properly redesigning the concept to certain troops, and especially all the various barbarians that used it, because either or both the Gauls, the Celts that had invaded Greece around that point, or the Oscan, the Italic mercenaries that Pyrrhus brought back from his Italian campaigns, right? And it's basically the scutum, if from an Italic way, that say the Celtic type of shield, again, it was practically almost the same of the Italic one, and to actually develop in parallel, right? They weren't actually, let's say, a copy of one another, as many people also inexplicably believe. And this sort of mechanism that we find in Xenophon, in Polybius, this easy explanation, this sort of technologistic bias, this positivistic, in fact, way of rationalizing at all costs, right, is always something you have to be extremely wary of, right? Because we know that things didn't really happen that way for many reasons. Now I can't simply digress. But what Polybius tells us indirectly is that at least by that point, it's much later to the 400 BC, Hellenic cavalry had this sort of oval shield at least. That was, by the way, smaller compared to the Italic and Celtic one, just in size, a little bit, because tureos literally meant door, right? Because it literally was that big to look like a door compared to the guy. Which is in fact also something that on horseback you can do up to a certain point. So from the iconographic analysis available, we have to think that good part of this various Xenophonian, let's say, gear was not necessarily in large use, widespread, so we can hypothesize that Xenophon had actually prescribed, on the basis of some personally acquired experience, a sort of ideal equipment that not everyone was capable or even willing to adopt in the first place. This is true if we interpret the text in a literalist way, right? Saying this is actually the standard type of equipment. And of course it wasn't. Nor Xenophon was actually writing in the sense that this should have been possible to be achieved for everybody, right? It was just, we have to understand also what kind of level of cavalryman here we're talking about in a, I don't know, political or social sense. It's so to say, like, if you want to be the cool guy, you must get, the most updated stuff, and so you're cool, right? And the others are not so cool, and that's why we don't write about. This is true, but at the same time, the comprehensive information that he provides us with regarding lots of things cavalry that we've seen, especially in the video about the Athenian one, etc. Also, not just about equipment, of course, suggest, in my opinion, again, that this form of heavier equipment was substantially more spread than we think, at least compared to the, again, say, obvious evidence provided by the prevalence of infantry and the centrality of hoplitic warfare, right? But that may have, again, not considered how similar cavalry was, and so how qualitative cavalry was compared to the to infantry. And part of the reason, again, is the fact that when cavalry is represented, say cavalry is, say, about infantry, you have lots of info just from the battle accounts because it was more important than cavalry, right? There is no doubt. In Europe, it's everywhere like this. Infantry is decisive, right? And cavalry not. And so the Greeks also have this bias against aristocrats, right? And they represent horsemen in their art mostly to look at guys that are a bit, however, more important than the average. So either, again, gods or heroes, or also aristocrats that, however, are represented more in this sort of idealized, sort of religious sense of, again, heroic nudity and all what that sort of bare-chested spirituality was about, was supposed to be in order to reach those levels towards which the Greeks were somehow critical, at least in the measure in which they had secularized consistently, also from a religious point of view compared to, say, the Romans, etc. So this may explain why we may have sort of underrated the importance of cavalry. It's also, in this period, it's also true, by the way, that what was happening overseas in barbaric lands, of course, with Xenophon we have the Anabasis, we have, say, in fact, he's famous mostly for this more fringe kind of, more even extrophile sort of, he wrote the Curopedia, so that you can imagine the level of criticism and flack that this guy took, also because he was exiled, famously enough, but for other reasons. But it's all one with the type of military culture that now was trying to be pushed, right? So for 400 BC, definitely we have the idea that yes, cavalry was rising in importance, and that already was likely becoming heavier, more compact, more effective in that regard, and that especially the richest cities, in spite of the fact that they had somehow led the hoplitic thing, had still proportionally now more wealth for the aristocracies as well, and that also the masses were somehow becoming more masses than they were, and so that's also the trend in Hellenism. And classical Hellenic warfare is always very interesting because it is somehow more mysterious than the fame of the period has led us believe. And I think this is most of the problem we have with it currently, right? So I think that's essentially the point we should look at when considering it in further detail, which I hope we'll be doing soon again, because as you know, I'm a medievalist. I stick more with the Romans, and just there is more about that in the first place. But I have also made a substantially large amount of Hellenic warfare videos by this point that I think are really becoming an interesting mass of material. And we have just begun, right? Literally, it's as if I hadn't even said the first, say, the foreword, let's say. But let's say, if time will allow us and other things, we will surely look at this further. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.